So who is Sun Tzu? Or more appropriately perhaps, who was Sun Tzu? Could try to have a quick look here at the myth and the truth. But let's be honest, it might just be a more appropriate myth. Sun Tzu lived a long time ago, and so many of the stories and legends that have come down about him we don't know. For a long time there's a question about whether he actually was real, whether he had really existed, or whether his work was simply a collection of other people's work or general sayings of the time that have been brought together at a later date. However, it is important to recognise that nowadays most historians think he was a real person, that there's been some evidence of finding while he may have been buried, etc. And even if he was not an individual, the fact that this were the victorious party's methods of describing how they achieved their victories, then this would still make them very important. It's important to understand things. What I'm trying to do here is basically address the way he's been presented in the West, but actually also sometimes in China with earlier dynasties, but ones after Sun Tzu, was as a kind of very centralizing, powerful individual, and so you things like The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump, etc., and things like that. But actually, that they're nothing to do with the way that Sun Tzu thought, and I think we'll address that. But it's worth knowing a little bit about him first. He's said to have lived and thought and composed his poetry and his work. Like I said, it's important to remember he's a great strategist, not despite being a poet, but because of being a poet, during the spring and autumn period. And this preceded the Warring States period, which is 481 to 221 BC. In this period, the Zhou dynasty had started to collapse. It had been unified China in 1046 BCE, and then around 256 BCE was coming to an end. And its client states, those many smaller kingdoms of smaller areas that had once been controlled by it, started to fight one another to become the new power, to take over charge and to become control of the new China. So one thing that we've been taught about Sun Tzu, which you've never heard before, is the lesson of the concubines. Sun Tzu was invited by the king to become a new general and was asked first to prove his abilities as a leader. So he said he could teach anyone to be a soldier, and the lesson of doing that was he took the king, had a harem of 180 women, and so he set himself a challenge. He's going to teach them all to march. The 180 of them, he said, the first thing you need to do, if you can have an army, you need to organize it. So he divided them into two companies. Then he said, of course, you're going to have an army, you need to have leadership. So he asked the king who were his favourite concubines. The king identified which of the two women were his favourites. He put one of each of the king's favourites in as a commander of each. There were now two companies of 90 concubines training to be soldiers, each commanded by a favourite of the king. And so Sun Tzu sent them a simple task, a simple drill, and made sure they understood what to do. And he said to them how to get off and do a simple military drill. So, for instance, marching back and forward, turning left and right, standing to attention, etc. And of course, once the women got going in this, they found it very funny, and they laughed and they giggled. And they wouldn't march, they wouldn't take it seriously. So Sun Tzu had said to the king, he was being given absolute power to prove his methods worked, and so he beheaded the two commanders, the two king's favourite concubines. Strangely enough, after this event, the women drilled perfectly. So he taught them to drill by the brutal execution of the two of them when they would not take it seriously. So what does this tell us about Sun Tzu? I mean, many things it tells us about. He must have been incredibly ruthless, really aggressive, but also brave, because he killed the king's two favourites. He had no idea how the king was going to react. He could well have been punished. It showed that he ruled through fear. He was arrogant. He believed he was so right. He was callous. But it also showed that if he took something on, if he was dedicated to an idea, then he would be dedicated to that cause to the end. And so these are the really important lessons of Sun Tzu. But actually, is this what it really tells us about Sun Tzu? Well, what does it actually tell us about Sun Tzu? Well, I'll tell you one thing for a fact. It tells us nothing about Sun Tzu. And the reason it tells us nothing about Sun Tzu is there's absolutely no evidence it ever happened. It was a myth invented by later people to make Sun Tzu sound like a more brutal individual, because this was the image they wanted in their generals and strategists. It tells us a lot about modern strategists, that many of them leap on this. And if you Google Sun Tzu, often the first thing you'll come across is the lesson of the concubines. And that is because modern strategists have based their ideas on the economic model of man, which I discussed in other videos, economicus strategicus, in strategic terms, taken away from that. And so it's really important for them to create this myth, this legend, this narrative, this culture around them, which is based on the brutality and the centralized power and the ruthlessness of Sun Tzu. So what does it tell us about? Well, it tells us about the Han Dynasty, which was centralizing China, and how it had to create this image of a centralized power, and this was the natural order of things, and the great strategy of the past had all believed in it, and they were very authoritarian in dictatorship, so they had to have that as well. It tells the same about the 19th century Victorians who spread this myth in the West, because they were creating this centralized power around the idea of this strategy that was callous and indifferent to people's plights. So that's what's really important. But actually, what the period we're talking about here is something that was called the Warring States period. Now, the point about the total war and the brutality and the central like that and the ruthlessness is the idea it may well work when you have a centralized authority crushing resistance and which is no one else has the full power to match it. They may fight in local areas. I mean, the US state, for instance, at the moment declares its ability to fight 3 wars at the same time. Okay, so that's the difference. You've got difference between the Han Dynasty and the 19th century Victorians with their centralized power, and you have the Warring States period of quite a large number of countries all squabbling over power. So let's to make this clear to you. I'll show you a map. This map is of China at the time of the Warring States period. So you have a number of dynasties: Zhao, Yan, Qi, Wei, Han, Chu, Qin, and they're all fighting for power over China. Now, if you took the classic model of strategy, the neoclassic model, so the economic model, the economic strategies, then you'd have this idea that people fight each other to the death. They throw themselves on them. But let's say the Qin and the Chu did that, the Han would just mop up the remains, or the Wei would mop up the remains. It's really important that the reasoning for Sun Tzu being actually this fight, the greatest victory is victory without fighting, with the idea that prolonged warfare is not good for the country, is nothing that he said. His concentration on spying and strategy and ideas and communications and leadership and training, etc., was all about trying to avoid wasteful and destructive fighting. He best take an army whole, especially if you're trying to unify China. If you conquer the Qin, and you want to bring the Qin's armies on your side, to help you out in future conquests. So it's really important for him to have this kind of diplomatic approach to things. And that's very relevant to modern day non-profit strategy, government strategy, political strategy, etc. Because we're talking about organizations with large numbers of stakeholders that we have to work with. And of course, because you have a large number of stakeholders which you have to work, then you need to have a different balance of powers. You can't afford to concentrate too much on one, but you can't afford to ignore others. Some are more powerful than others. You have to take this into allowance, into consideration, etc. But in the end, you can't ignore all of them. You can't ignore some of them. You can't just concentrate on one. You can't have a very single-minded power, which is why you do see these books that are supposedly based on Sun Tzu and have no relevance to his teaching, his writing. So therefore, I think it's really important. The reason why we look at Sun Tzu is because of the chaotic period in which he wrote, and that is why it is particularly relevant, his work, towards those of us who work very much within the non-governmental sector. So thank you for listening, and I hope this has been useful, and I hope you'll be able to watch some more of my videos that deal with the important sector of public sector strategy.